See if it works. Yeah, why would it? Fantastic. All right. Try it again. Okay, good. We're in business. So we're looking at the legislative branch. Again, this becomes a lot of our, the three branches is where we'll spend some of the most amount of time given their kind of critical nature. What building am I showing you? That's the Capitol, right? Who's been to DC? Who's been to the Capitol? Anybody seen floor action? Just out of curiosity? All right. So this is where you'd go to see Congress in session. There are two sides, one side for the House, the other side for the Senate. And we'll come to that building in a little bit. But where we're going to start is at the very beginning. And we're just going to remind you, again, we've covered the Constitution, we've covered the sequence and its logic, but let's just remind you here that in the Constitution, the legislative branch was created first. It's in Article 1. That sends a deliberate signal. What that says is, first is arguably the most important. So they established the legislative branch first, signaling what they think of it. It's a bicameral legislature. Again, my assumption is this is bedrock stuff. You remember the tensions between large states and small states over representation. Our current election, you see it play out. You see that argument for should California have more votes? Should Texas have more votes? Should Florida have more votes? In this case, in the Electoral College. And I think you can see the arguments for and against. Well, more people, more votes. But what about other states? Shouldn't they have a say? Shouldn't Montana be able to weigh in? Shouldn't the Dakotas be able to weigh in? And what we came up with was that down-the-middle compromise, the Great Compromise, the Connecticut Compromise. Again, it creates a bicameral legislature where both sides get a little bit of what they want. We get representation based on statehood, and we get representation based on population. Again, we'll work out numerics, but just to kind of put you on the spot. Total number of representatives, 435. Total number of senators, 100, right? So we've got, proportional representation, and we've got representation based on statehood. Every state is equally represented. So what I want to look at is, this is the historic intent. The idea was to create the legislative branch first. We expect them to basically play the leading role. We put them up first. We expect them to be the dominant force in government. The modern reality is something, maybe a little bit different. I'm gonna talk about this with the executive branch as well. In many ways, we sometimes set government up for failure based on our expectations. And we've got a lot of expectations surrounding Congress, and in many cases, it gives them multiple roles, often conflicting roles, and therefore an impossible scenario. So, and we're going to see this in a minute in numbers too. One of the, as we kind of expect all this from Congress, and as they're unable to deliver, what we put up as first and the most important branch is often looked at as the most disliked branch of government. So we'll cover that in a second. So first and foremost, what are they supposed to do? Well, they're supposed to be national policymakers. Again, we have a federal system. We just looked at that. You have local, state, and federal government, and their major role is to pass national legislation. Legislation that is for the benefit and the good of the entire nation. And yet, they are arriving at this legislation as advocates for their constituency. So again, if a politician says, my constituents, who are they referring to? The people that elected them. So if I am a senator, what's my constituency? The state. If I am a representative, district, right? So I'm coming in and I'm trying to represent Essex. I'm trying to represent Massachusetts. And we have our own narrow selfish interest. But I also have to think of the larger national concerns. Is that my ringing or somebody else? So that's two sets of conflicting kind of priorities. But then bring in the idea of party. Bring in the idea that that's a factor that kind of pulls and pushes them in different directions. we're going to see too that chambers are unique. And again, I'll harp on this all year, but it comes back to numbers. The size of the Senate makes it different than the House, and they have kind of different personality quirks and different tendencies, and that's another kind of pull-push factor. They have a role as a watchdog. One of the things I've kind of embedded in the PowerPoint we'll come to later, is you'll look through like their committee work especially, how they can kind of spotlight and bring national attention to certain issues and essentially act as a court of inquiry where they kind of get to the bottom of things. So their job is consistently to be a watchdog. All of this alone would be overwhelming. But what you're going to see is essentially, for representatives especially, they're already starting to think about the next election cycle. And they're already starting to think about how do I line up the massive amounts of money that I need to run for office. So there are these continual pressures of thinking about all of these things and its impact on elections. How do I do all of these jobs and still have time to fundraise? How do I do this under the lens of an incredibly critical media? Because like I said, on many levels we look at the legislative branch kind of with some of the most expectations and the least favor. This is one way of showing you. You're going to see that they suffer under this scrutiny. And that's really what we're going to be looking at here. We're going to be looking at what is kind of on paper, but what is in reality. What can we realistically expect from Congress? Let's start with some of the basics. So what we would continue to do as you look at the Constitution is you realize there are some formal qualifications, and they are minimal. We're in Article 1, Section 2 and 3, and what we see is some different qualifications based on the chambers. And again, I'm going to say this like 1,000 times. The numeric differences that you see here will explain why the chambers are different. Again, if I'm predicting potential essay questions, I could see one where you have to kind of explain how the House might look at a particular issue versus the Senate based on their differences. Okay? And one of the differences start with just the minimum requirements to be in office. You have to be 25 years old to be in the House of Representatives, slightly older in the Senate. Citizen for 7 years. Again, the idea was we are a nation of immigrants. Immigrants often have to overcome massive obstacles to kind of get here, whether it's language or distance or culture or the economics of it. And so often, I know the current election spins it maybe a little differently, but often, people that immigrate are among the best and the brightest, or at least the ones that really can overcome adversity. And we want to welcome their contributions, but we want to make sure that they have assimilated, that they have had enough time to be here to adopt American culture and values. So we come up with a number, 7, citizen for 7 years. And then in the Senate, 9. Why is 9 good? Because it's not 7. Why is 7 good? Because it's not 9. So again, they have that kind of funny argument in the Federalist Papers where we just have a little higher requirement. Therefore, the Senate is seen as superior is the wrong word, but you're going to see a more elite way of kind of looking at the issues versus a more kind of populist or popular way of looking at the issues. And that is deliberate. That balance is kind of deliberate. Both have to be legal residents of the state that they're representing. In many ways, that's the simplest of the requirements. You can talk about Hillary Clinton or Scott Brown. I'm assuming you're familiar with both those political figures. When they decided they wanted to do a Senate run, they had multiple states that they had residency in, and largely it was a matter of looking at where am I most viable. Okay, so really what you need for legal residency is whatever the state establishes, and that might be a mailing address with a couple of pieces of mail indicating you've got an electric and a gas bill. Might be a little more formal than that. Maybe you need to own property. So those are the minimum requirements. But what I'm going to show you, I did it with the Constitutional Convention. Remember when we talked about them being an assembly of demigods? I'm going to do it when we talk about the president, how we've got these minimal requirements, and yet look at how we vote. And what does that say about our informal requirements? What do we expect from government? And in each instance, the question that comes up is, should our representative bodies and our democratic institutions look more like us? Because when you look at the breakdown of the House and the Senate, and I'm looking at the 114th Congress, the most recent one, not the new one that's coming in. But as I look at them, what we see in general is they're older. So average age in the House is 57. Average age in the Senate is 61. The median age, the kind of middle age in our country, is around 38. And, you do have some young people that are, coming off a spring break and hanging out in the House and having a great time. But you do have, that's Dianne Feinstein, 85 years old, and very capable, but, kind of surprising to picture an 85-year-old in the Senate having 6-year terms, right? So when she gets reelected, Strom Thurmond, I believe, was like 92 or 3. And he was still in the Senate, and they were kind of leading him to rooms, like, you're supposed to be here now. And he'd thank them and do his thing. You see that they are, and this is perhaps a good thing in terms of skewed, but they are disproportionately educated compared to the American public. So a bachelor's degree, and this is probably a good gut check for you. I think, again, this current election really shows us how much we all live in bubbles, and we use social media to get into our own echo chambers. And we just kind of reinforce our own preconceptions about politics and the nation. Both sides, I think, want to dismiss the other side as fringe. Well, one of the things that happens, and that happened for me when I went to school in the South, was I got out of my bubble and I realized, holy cow, everybody doesn't act and think like me. Are you surprised that only 29% of the American public, and this is 25 and older, have a bachelor's degree? That, for you guys, going to college may seem like the norm, and you may think 100% of people go on to college, but that's not the case. And so my House and Senate don't exactly look like the general population. It is striking to think about, geez, you've got 20 people in Congress that don't have a college degree. They simply have a high school degree. Now, my assumption, I haven't dug into it too much, is that perhaps they're military, because that often is something that definitely qualifies somebody, I think, to be a representative. In terms of advanced degrees, does that number surprise you? 8% of people go on to get a master's or a higher degree. And so, again, we see disproportionately educated, maybe not a bad thing. In terms of field of experience, people usually come to politics from somewhere else. So what you see is business and the law are two of the predominant kind of backgrounds of people that are in the House and the Senate. Whereas if you look at the nation, there are it's funny. There had been a glut of lawyers recently. A lot of people going on to get their degree in that, and it didn't always work out because how many jobs are there in law? We're a fairly litigious society, but there seemed to be a glut, and yet it's only 0.4% of the American public. Definitely skewed there. They are disproportionately rich, right? 50% of the House and 50% of the Senate are millionaires. Roughly 3% of the United States are millionaires. The median income, the middle income for Americans is $56,000. So they get a lot of money. They're disproportionately male, 80% versus less than half the percent of the American public. They're disproportionately white. You're talking 80 and 94%, whereas in the U.S. it's 63%. And so by the inverse, they don't quite represent the people of color, the minority groups, in equal numbers. So you can see that blacks are, if it's 12% of the population is black, they're definitely underrepresented in the Senate, and there's some parity in the House. Hispanics, the largest growing minority group, 17%, and they're definitely underrepresented at 4 and 8%. Asian, 5%. And maybe some, close to balance in the House at 3%. They are disproportionately, well, not disproportionately, I take that back. It does seem to be, we're a majority Christian nation. About 70% of the nation that's the umbrella term, Christian. Whereas in the world, most Christians are Catholic. In the U.S., most Christians are Protestant. So again, Christianity has 3 branches: Roman Catholic, Greek, Eastern Orthodox, and Protestantism. And that's the dominant kind of Christian faith in the U.S. And what you see is, those numbers kind of play out in the House and the Senate. And we are seeing some, rising representation of some of the minority religious groups. What's interesting too is the military used to be almost like a prerequisite, especially for president. Especially around the era of the Vietnam War. The big question was, did you serve or did you use political connections to avoid Vietnam? We often consider the person who was going to be commander-in-chief had to have some sort of military experience. And that does play down through the House and the Senate as well. We do see, disproportionate numbers in that there's only 7% of the United States has been in active service. 0.4% of the United States is serving in many ways so that we can all live more safely and more comfortably. That's I think we have to understand how so many rely on so few for such a great kind of sacrifice. So I think those numbers are kind of important. There it is in chart form. There it is in graph form. And I'm just kind of including these things because often one of the 4 questions you have on the test have to do with looking at a chart or a graph and figuring out a trend. And so these are fairly obvious. You can kind of see that, male, disproportionately represented. White, disproportionately represented. Religion, Catholic and Protestant, seem to be the 2 major religions. This one is interesting because you have to work at it a little harder. What you're seeing is you've got kind of the leanings, relative to the U.S. population, the odds of being a lawyer in the House relative to the general population. So you see all the lines over here. Republican, Democrat, you're still more likely to be a lawyer than people in the United States. You're more likely to be a military veteran. You're more likely to be old. But what's interesting is as we get to kind of the ethnicities and the gender, you begin to see the Democratic Party represents, blacks, females, Hispanics a little bit more so. They have a little more diversity within the Democratic Party, hence the blue line's kind of over here, and the red line's pushed that way, where it's less likely. So again, I'm just including, some of these charts that you may have to look at, and to an adult we look at it and go, oh, I got it. I understand what it's saying. Then you guys may look at it and go, huh. So whenever you're doing like your readings in the chapters, don't skip those text boxes. Don't skip where there's a chart or graph. Always look at it and say, what's the trend? What's the chart or graph trying to show me? Because again, 90% of the time, one of the 4 questions is doing simply that, looking at a graph, a chart, and saying, what's the trend, and then explaining the trend, all right? This is one way to show you the trends, right? Here's another way. A lot of white guys, a lot of white Protestant guys, a lot of white Protestant, college-educated, wealthy guys. When I worked as an intern, when I was at college, and I was in D.C., one of the great opportunities you could have is to go intern for a representative. And, eventually you get to start doing more and more interesting stuff, and you might, walk bills around to find signatures for, not that I'm lobbying anybody to sign the bill, but I was told to go walk this over here and go get a signature. You might go to a committee meeting and take some notes. You might go to a floor session and take some notes. There's all kinds of things you do, and you have to kind of know who's who. So what was really cool for me was like, this was like baseball cards times 1,000. These were my celebrities, right? And it has like all their stats, what state they're from, how long they've served, what committees they're on. But it always struck me as it's like white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy, white guy. What you've seen over time is we have gotten more diverse in terms of groups that are being represented. So you begin to see here with the 60th Congress, we're in the 114th. About to go 115th over here, that around the 60th Congress is when you begin to kind of, break the, we're looking at, again, can I understand what I'm looking at? These are the Congresses. What do these numbers represent? Why is it up to 600? Yeah, it's out of 535, right? So that's why it kind of taps out here. That's why it's kind of a flat line. And what we see is, females have made some inroads. Whites and Hispanics and blacks and Asians, people of color have made some inroads. We're seeing that there's increasing diversity, but it's still not obviously proportional to how the rest of society is structured. So again, one of the things I think you have to think about is do my Democratic bodies have to look like me? Okay? There's an argument that I would prefer people that are smarter than me, more educated than me, more savvy in business. I want elites to kind of run things. They're the ones that understand Syria. They're the ones that understand a complex economy. But on the other hand, I want the people that are governing for me to know me and to kind of understand my concerns and why I might be struggling in an economy, whereas they are not. And they may attribute that, well, of course everybody can succeed in the economy because they have, right? The best example, and I've mentioned to you before, is when you found, like again, I am a husband, I have a wife, I have a mother, I have a daughter. I am, any rights that women win, my family does better, right? So women's rights is a family issue to me. When my wife gets paid more, that's a family issue. When more opportunities are there for my daughter, that's a family issue. So that's really important to me. And yet I probably have blinders when it comes to certain women issues. As progressive as I try to be, there are probably things that I'm not aware of that are important based on gender. The best example is when women, I don't have my chart up anymore, when women began to be represented more in Congress, you began to see more spending on women's health issues. So again, as progressive as I can be, I might not think about ovarian cancer, breast cancer, other kind of illnesses that uniquely affect women as having a priority. It just would be in one of my blinders, and I'm not directing funds to kind of tackle those things. So I want smart and elite people who know better than me, but I want those people to also know me and be able to represent me. We tend to be, pretty demanding as a public in that sense, right? So to continue just to look at basic structure and differences, and again, this should be fairly familiar. Senate and the House, again, have different term lengths, and again, it results in different kind of characteristics of the body. So we've got 6 years and 2 years. Why is 6 years good? Because it's not 2. Why is 2 years good? It's because it's not 6. More formally, what can you do in 6 years? Well, you can govern with a high degree of autonomy. You can be much more independent. In the House, you tend to be much more responsive to the people that you're representing, because they will remember. If you voted to, let's say, either undo Obamacare or preserve Obamacare, depending on whichever side of the fence you're on, they're going to remember that. They're going to remember that you either supported the Democratic will or went against it. Whereas in 6 years, arguably, we forget things. And we move on to the next kind of news cycle, whatever the next thing is up for kind of thought. So again, what I have is this increased independence. What I have over time, the longer you do the job, the better you get at it. And that's an interesting kind of argument for, there's arguments for term length. And the current Congress is looking at that. Trump says, I want to drain the swamp. I want to get moneyed interest out of government. I want to, have representatives have to kind of consider term lengths, and I suppose there's an argument for that. Again, what percent of the time do incumbents win? 90 to 95% of the time. So that sounds like the game is rigged. But let's kind of flip it on its head for a second. I now have 20 years of experience, and I arguably kind of have just begun to figure out what I'm doing. Just started to get kind of my head around it. Like, I think I know how to teach now, right? Should I have to leave so that you can bring in a freshman teacher, right? Arguably with the time comes experience, and that's not always the case. I'm just coming around to PowerPoint. What the heck is that all about, Mr. Hastings? That's been around since like the 90s. So sometimes you get kind of new blood, new innovative ideas, people that are willing to kind of challenge the status quo. But, the compromise, therefore, is that expertise. Also continuity. In the Senate, again, in particular, because it is the branch with that power of advice and consent, they are the ones that are going to be deciding about impeachment. They're going to be the ones that confirm appointments. They're going to be the ones that confirm the treaties. So we want to make sure that they are having the independence, having the expertise, but also having some continuity, familiar with what they're doing. In the most recent election cycle, not all 100 senators were up for re-election. Only a third of them were. And the idea is, if we had some sort of populist or major political realignment, at most all you would lose is a third of your senators, and you'd have 2/3 who kind of remember how we do things. So we stagger the election cycle of the senators so that a third of them come up for re-election every 2 years. They serve 6-year terms, but those terms are staggered. Does that make sense? All right. So there's all kinds of logic for how things are structured, and again, it leads to kind of chambers that look different and act different. So speaking of the incumbency advantage, we just mentioned, and we kind of covered that in both instances, you see this incumbency advantage, this tendency. On average, both chambers, get returned. The person who's holding office gets returned 95% of the time. What I want you to see, and I'll come back to it, is, again, picture just getting charts, graphs, things to kind of look at and having to kind of pick out a trend. One of the trends I see is that incumbency rate is high in both chambers. But I also see kind of a more consistent incumbency rate with the House, where it's a little more volatile in the Senate. And that seemed to be kind of counterintuitive. I thought you said the Senate was, more independent. And they are in some ways, at least in terms of issues. But what happens is, what's more valuable to you? 1 out of 435 or 1 out of 100? Where do you think you see more determined campaign efforts to unseat somebody? Right? The Senate is arguably the more impactful House, and therefore you often see kind of greater challenges within that chamber. So you see a slightly more stable rate in the House, and it often has to do with the fact that they go after Senate seats more aggressively. It also, if I were to ask you right now to name your senators, you got them? Who are they? Elizabeth Warren and Ed Markey. What about your congressmen? Did somebody have to think a little bit more? We'll bring images up for them. So the senators are more high profile. Elizabeth Warren this morning, or the other day, penned a letter to Donald Trump, asking him to, looking at his transition team, looking at some of his appointments, and seeing that, you were talking about getting away from special interests, but she is arguing that there are a lot of special interest in Wall Street figures within his transitional team. She makes herself high profile. That letter that she sent got in the national news cycle, okay? Whereas Seth Moulton has said some critical things as well. He's not quite as much in the news cycle. So more visible means more of a bullseye on you as well. Maybe more power, but more of a bullseye. In the House, what is funny is the way that the incumbency advantage works is there is a familiarity with the name, but maybe not anything beyond that. So literally people will go into the voting booth, especially, who voted? There was like 3 of you, right, that got to vote. Did you recognize all the names as you went down ballot? No, right? And so what would be a strategy that you might use to kind of navigate that? Hey, I don't know this name. What are some of your options?
Sheriff. I didn't know any of them, so I voted for the person that's closest to my house.
So you voted for the person that was by party or by? Say it again.
I looked at the party, but I was like, I'll just vote for whoever's closest to me.
So you, in terms of like where they were in the ballot?
No, like
lived closest to you. I got you. Lived closest. Now I'm following you. Okay, so you kind of like try to use some sort of construct that basically helped you see the person as being more in alignment with you because they're regionally kind of more familiar with what you're about.
Yeah.
Okay. Could you have left it blank? Hey, I'm not making an informed choice, I'll leave it blank. I'll leave it up to somebody who's more informed than me. The other strategy that people might use, I like the geography one, is party. The final one that they might use is, hey, I know that name. I know that. So Frank Cousins was the sheriff for the longest time, and hey, I have a cousin. I like the name Cousins. Check the box. Name familiarity kind of is what often plays out for the House, because it's this funny thing of they are kind of less visible, and therefore you rely more on name recognition as opposed to kind of like policy recognition. The other thing too to think about is think about if you lose one seat out of 435 as a percentage. Think about if you lose one seat out of 100 as a percentage. So does that explain kind of how you might, and again, we're talking like 1 out of 33 too in some ways. We can even skew that number a little smaller because only a third are coming up for re-election every 6 years. So that might explain some of the skewed lines. So these dates, you can kind of read about where you see these kind of plunges to also correspond to historic events where I might hold the senators more accountable. Watergate, you had the kind of the Republican sweep, starting with Reagan and then in '94. So there's some historic rationale for those things as well. One thing I do want to kind of remind you, though, is isn't this a funny contrast here? We return incumbents 90 to 95% of the time, but in survey after survey, if you ask people, do you approve of the job Congress is doing, they historically say no. There's only 11% of the American public in the most recent study of 2015 that say we approve of the job that Congress is doing. What explains this contrast? Where you ask them, do you think members deserve re-election? Do you think your own member deserves re-election? And yet, how often do they get re-elected? Right? So there is this mentality of like, we don't like the job Congress is doing. And man, are they in some abysmal numbers. And yet, we keep returning our congressmen time after time. The rationale is this. I may not like Congress, but I like my guy, because my guy is doing all kinds of, we're going to see this later, it's called casework. They are in its more ugly form, we'll call it pork barrel politics, where they're kind of bringing home the bacon. They bring benefits to our district. So I don't like it as a whole. I look at Congress as doing all this self-serving legislation, but I like it when my guy does it. And that kind of explains the reason for the trend. All right, to keep looking at just some structural differences. Again, I had mentioned there's a formula that we use to kind of determine the total numbers, and you guys did those numbers up front. That you get 2 senators per state, that equals 100. Your representation in the House is based on population, that number is 535. Just to throw some other ideas at you, again, when we were electing the Senate, because of this number and because of the heightened importance of the Senate, you are not considered intelligent enough to elect the president, as the founders kind of set things up, hence the Electoral College, and not necessarily intelligent enough to elect senators. Some of the logic of the founders, too, is we didn't have the infrastructure that you saw they talked about in the video. There weren't transportation and telecommunication networks that connected us. So arguably, you could have a presidential candidate. If you were having like popular elections, you could have people across the country who know nothing of that presidential candidate. We kind of lived in geographic isolation. So I get why you don't necessarily get to elect the president. We want people in the know who know the best and the brightest to maybe choose, right? That's their logic. They use the same logic to say you shouldn't elect a senator. The position is more important. We're going to have state legislatures elect. We changed that with the 17th Amendment. Our history is all about becoming increasingly democratic. Now, in the House, the numbers are kind of funny. Because if you set it based on population, and if population is continually growing, do you see a looming problem? If what you have is simply a formula, that for every 500,000 people you get one representative, what eventually happens to your chamber? If I just use a formula, what happens, Jack?
It becomes like massive.
It becomes massive, and therefore again, think about why we have representative democracy in the first place. It's because it is arguably more efficient for a large population. I have informed people who can efficiently debate issues. If I have 100,000 in the chamber, you're not getting anything done. So they put a cap on it artificially in 1929 at 435. And what it means, roughly, although this will continue to be kind of skewed, is one representative for every 500,000 people. Does that seem like it works out? Is there a point where there's one representative for every 1,000,000 people, and is everybody being kind of represented? I don't know whether or not eventually they'll have to adjust that number. I would suspect not, but I do think there is a point where that ratio seems to come out of balance, right? So what I will start to do more so tomorrow, I just want to set this up, is I want to kind of talk about the numbers more than just a generic number, but I want to talk about why Massachusetts gets 11, why California gets 55. And it has to do with knowing where the people are. Every 10 years we do a census, and we figure out where the people are. And if people have moved, and they do move, or if populations haven't grown enough, and that happens, we have to readjust our numbers. We have to do what's called reapportionment. So, for example, recently Massachusetts population grew, but not fast as some of the other states. And so they basically said we have to take away a representative from you and give it to somewhere else. When you do that, you also have to redraw the lines. Okay? You have to do what is called redistricting. So we'll go through it a little more slowly, but that is, a process of doing the census. This is a map where you see, okay, based on the census, these states in yellow lost population, these states in blue gained population. I need to change my numbers. And when you change your numbers, you got to change your borders. All right, so we'll go back through that on tomorrow.
Will Caitlin Moore please come to guidance